I'm here to share my experience camera trapping in the Tetons. So I started out originally as a fine artist. I got into wildlife photography to create reference images for my art. I ended up just really liking the adventure and the conservation aspects of wildlife photography even more, so it became even more of a passion for me. I haven't been in the business long. I started very seriously in 2019, although I've lived here since 2015. But I've been working the past few years full time as a freelance camera trapper and wildlife photographer. I believe that my artistic background has given me a lot of advantages to get good at this that's transferred well to my other skill set, which so here's my old work versus what I do now. This was a pen and ink drawing of the Chinese zodiac. And here's Bruno from the spring. This was the mountain lion of the Maverick. I included it because she was the inspiration for a lot of my current work. My passion for mountain lions kind of started there, which is how I got into camera trapping, because I really wanted to get more images of mountain lions. And obviously they're not the easiest animal to find on foot. So here's a more recent image. It's I actually took this from a blind of a mountain lion mother feeding on an elk carcass, and the cub was watching a herd of deer that passed below the blind. He came out to watch them as they went by. And as we hiked out sometime after the lions had left the kill, we actually encountered them again, and the herd of deer was in between us and the cats, and they were stomping their feet, and their eyes were glowing in the dark like something out of an African safari. It was really amazing. One of the best experiences of my life. Here's a wolf with a road-killed elk. Everyone's favorite $3.99. And a beaver from last fall, just to show you some of the wildlife work I've done. My gear, for the people that are interested in that, I use a Nikon Z9 currently. Most of my work was done with a D850. I use a 400 f2.8 lens. For camera trapping, I use a Nikon D750, sometimes my D850, and Cam Traptions gear, SB28 flashes, Cam Traptions flashes, and then here's a couple of the lenses I use: 24 f1 2.8 and a 24 to 120. So I believe that fieldcraft and tracking is one of the most important skills that you can pick up to really distinguish yourself as a wildlife photographer. Being able to interpret sign that you encounter allows you to make informed decisions, especially in camera trapping, which is important because in camera trapping, you are kind of doing the reverse of most wildlife photography, which you're creating your composition beforehand based on what sign that you found. You are not reacting to the subject in person. A great example of that was this image I got a couple years ago of this mountain lion mother. There was no snow at the time because it was in March. And I picked this spot for one reason, because it seemed to be along the corridor they were traveling. There is a big boulder on one side and a puddle on the other. And I saw this little crack in the rock, which you can see in front of her front paw, where something had stepped on this really thin piece of rock. So I thought maybe that's where they were traveling. So I focused right there on that rock, and sure enough, that's exactly where she ended up. So that's a great example of how tracking skills can really give you an advantage in this style of photography. familiarize yourself with nesting behaviors of birds and their nesting requirements if you want to find them. You definitely don't want to set up camera traps on nests, but that's just an example of something that can really give you an edge in the wildlife photography world. Carrion birds give away kill sites. Definitely avoid that during bear active months, but overall, they're a great way to help find lion kills in the winter. Tracking's really fun and addicting. I mean, it's a passion of mine that's kind of even outside of photography for photography purposes. I like to take casts of really interesting tracks with 2 parts plaster and 1 part water. So here's an example of a great track. The one on top is a wolf going one direction. The one on the bottom is a mountain lion going the other. This is a great example of knowing your surroundings, because these are 2 different species. They're 2 species that people often get confused, and that just gives you an idea of what was traveling on this game trail at the time. My favorite book about tracking is North American Mammal Tracks and Sign by Mark Elbrock, the 2nd edition. That's definitely what I would recommend picking up if you're interested in pursuing this skill set. Picking up basic tracking skills has given me the ability to notice subtleties in the woods I normally would overlook, which leads to some really exceptional finds that you otherwise would have missed. Tracking is not just about tracks. It's bird songs, it's skull and bone ID, it's feeding sign on trees and vegetation, feather IDs. All of these give you subtle clues to what's going on in the surrounding area. Lion scrapes are really important too for camera trapping lions. They're kind of scent mark where the lion will leave scrapes in the debris on the ground with its back legs. It'll typically urinate or defecate on top of the scrape and leave this as kind of like a business card to other lions in the area, which will come. They'll leave their own scent markings in the area, and they'll use it to find out who's using their territory, and they'll use it for breeding purposes as well. And that's just a great thing to recognize. It's really subtle. It's just kind of a disturbance in the soil, but when you find it, you know that that's a spot that lions are using. And as a former artist, snow is a canvas and tracks are the artwork that tell a story if you can interpret it. And here's one of my favorite tracks that I've found. This is a gray wolf stay bed. I don't think she laid down there very long, but you can actually see the impression of where her ribs are, and of course her tail and her feet before she got up and walked away. On the left here is my boot track with a bear track on top of it, and on the right is my boot track with a lion cub track on top of it. So sometimes when you're out looking for creatures, they're behind you instead of in front of you. And that happens a lot when you're patterning animals and taking the same trails over and over again. But I thought those were neat. So why camera trap? In most wildlife photography, you're like I already said, you are reacting to a subject, where this is kind of the reverse, where you're picking your composition beforehand, which allows for a lot of creative freedom. And then the chance, the surprise, and the fun, the adventure aspect is huge for me. This is a good example of a surprise, not a great surprise, but this grizzly I got on a camera trap actually only had 3 legs. You can see his front left leg is totally cut off if you look closely. And I got plenty of images of him, and he definitely only has 3 legs. Just something that I would never have thought was out there. Which has been reported to the authorities, and they've been investigating the situation. It allows for a fly on the wall type experience with wildlife, which is a lot different than what you get when you're physically present. It's very candid, it's very real. So with that in mind, you get a lot of unique behavior. And then obviously there are also some species like mountain lions that just don't tolerate human presence very well. So camera trapping is a great way to try to get images of those cats or those species that don't like human presence. It's also a great way to get night photos, which obviously is not super common in most wildlife photography. And then you're getting images while you're asleep, which is also really nice. As well as really remote locations that you couldn't afford to stake out. Because I can hike out all my gear miles and miles into the woods, leave it for a couple weeks, and then come back and who knows what's on the card. It's a couple examples of some of the camera trap images I've taken. This is one of my favorites. This is the cub that left the track on top of my boot track right there.
Oh,
And
wow.
that,
Grizzly bear with 3 legs.
yeah. It's a big male mountain lion on a kill. So how do you camera trap? Camera trapping requires the usage of a lot of technology, and it all has to work together and it all has to work. So there's a lot that can go wrong, but trial and error, you can, it's easier than it seems. So Camtraptions is the brand that I use. There's also Cognisys. There's also a couple other brands that I've worked with, but I use Camtraptions. It's a little cheaper. The main difference between Camtraptions and Cognisys, to my understanding, is that Camtraptions works with heat motion sensor that detects animals based off of their heat. And then Cognisys is like a beam that has to be broken. It sends out a beam, and the beam is broken when something crosses it. So you need receivers for the camera, a receiver for the camera, and receivers for each flash, a transmitter for the camera hot shoe, flashes, either Camtraptions makes flashes, but Nikon SB28s are kind of an industry standard where everybody uses those. They work really well, and they're able to go to sleep and wake up, which is really good for battery preservation. And a PIR motion sensor. So how does it work? I put together this little diagram, which here's a Wolverine passing my camera trap, which is obviously wishful thinking, but so first up, your animal triggers the motion sensor, which is here, number 1 on the diagram. That motion sensor is going to send a signal to the receiver that's plugged into the camera itself. The receiver is going to send a signal to the transmitter in the hot shoe of the camera, which is going to send signals to each of the flashes, and then all of them are going to go off at once. So it's all a communication system. How do you camera trap part 2? It may appear intimidating, but the equipment is easier than it looks once you get used to it. Trial and error is huge. There's a lot that can go wrong. I mean, even something as simple as like leaving one switch flipped in the off position is enough to ruin everything. So you have to be really careful about that. And then I always, you definitely want to test everything before you go by jumping in front of the camera, see if everything goes off, make sure all the flashes go off. I use rechargeable batteries. I think that's really important because you're going to be going through a lot of battery power. You definitely want to not be wasteful. A voltmeter is a good tool to have too, to double check on what batteries have gone out of power and what still has a good charge when you're swapping bats out. Sometimes this isn't really often necessary, but I have used dummy batteries before, which is switching the battery inside the camera body to a external power source, which has a lot more power. And that can be used in the wintertime, especially when it gets really cold, your battery life expectations drop. Another thing is you really don't need a fancy camera body. It doesn't need to be very fast. DSLRs are great. You don't need a mirrorless camera in your camera trap. It doesn't need to be a huge file size because, like I said, you're picking the composition beforehand, so you're probably not going to be cropping a lot. So it's a great way to recycle old camera bodies that you have that maybe don't have a life anymore. So the settings I use, you definitely want a fairly deep photo. You want the depth of field to be as big as possible, just to try to have that margin of error not super small. Manual focus where you anticipate your subject to be. So if that's on a game trail, you can gauge where you expect the animal to appear, and then you'll have the motion sensor right there. I use manual settings typically, but because I generally only want nighttime photos, but if you want to be able to take both, you can use shutter priority and set like a parameters for your ISO. And that way you can get day shots and night shots where the camera is balancing the exposure. I'm usually around 1/25 of a second. Long exposure night shots are definitely possible with camera trapping, which is really unique. It's a way to get stars and your subject without using a composite. So that's a really fun detail that a lot of people are interested in. And that's just when your flash captures the animal, then you'll have the image exposed for another 10 seconds or so, and you'll catch the stars behind the creature. So as far as scouting goes, animal patterns are highly variable, so you'll have to learn that with whatever animal that you're targeting. Really, generally speaking, the animals tend to be fairly low in the winter and fairly high in the summer, so there's a lot more hiking involved in the summer. Finding fresh sign on a game trail is a great start. As you start to get photos, you can start to pattern individual animals. So just really pay attention to what time he comes through, what day he comes through, how often. You'll start to get to know individual animals, and then you can kind of predict their behavior a bit better. The snow obviously makes things much, much easier. Trail cameras are a great way to scout. They can be pretty inexpensive, like Cam Park they're very cheap if you wanted to buy a lot. There's also high quality ones like Brownings. I tend to use a lot of Brownings. Reconyx is a bit outside my price range, but those are very nice. There's also cellular trail cameras, which will text you images as they happen if there's cell service available. So that's a pretty cool tool. I don't get to use it very often, but when I do have an area that has cell service, I can put it on like a kill, for example, and get images sent to my phone, which is pretty cool to say, oh, look, there's a lion eating it right now. Ethics is a huge topic in camera trapping because there's a lot that can go wrong if you choose to make bad decisions with a camera trap. So I'll just share what I've personally discovered, what I personally believe. Because obviously, if you're setting up a camera with flashes on in certain areas, there's definitely places that you really want to avoid. So dens and nests are big ones. You definitely don't want to put it on an active den because you could absolutely just terrorize the inhabitants and force them to move away. I like to use single shot instead of any kind of burst functions with the camera or with the camtraptions gear, because that just tends to be received better if you have spaced out shots versus just like flash banging anything. And also an intervalometer I've used before on kills, so the camera's not going off just constantly. You can set it to once every minute or so. Definitely don't use lures or bait. It's really unethical. I mean, I'm sure I don't have to explain that to most of you, but a lot of camera trappers do use lures, and it can force animals to use up their their energy to try to chase what they think will be a food source, only to find out it's just a scent lure. So it's just not a nice thing to do. I also, I mean, as a side note, I really don't think those images look very good, because you can usually tell when an animal's been lured in, because it's sniffing the ground or rolling around in a scent lure. In my experience, canids, like coyotes and wolves, seem to be really, really sensitive. They don't like being camera traps, so I actively avoid them. That being said, they also actively avoid my gear. I don't really disguise my gear super much. It's kind of obvious where it is because I don't want to surprise animals. Foxes are pretty tolerant, but coyotes and wolves just don't like it. But like I said, they also typically choose not to walk directly in front of my camera trap anyways. Mountain lions, on the other hand, seem to be to it. They can have
Oh.
And you wonder, what was that?
Oh, we lost you there for just a second. So.
Oh no.
Yeah. So you were saying the mountain lions are unbothered, I think is where you were.
Okay, yeah, they can be relatively completely unbothered, or relatively completely unreactive to flashes. Obviously, you want to set your flashes kind of back from the subject too. You don't want it to be right in their eyes or their face. But mountain lions, in my experience, have been really good subjects. Bears, same thing. They're not concerned about being flashed, but they do get really curious and they see it as a big chew toy, so they'll come dismantle everything. Fairly often they'll come chew on your stuff. Another big one is, from what I understand, and I've been told, using flash at night on birds on their dilated eyes is really bad for them. So that's another animal that you want to avoid, is like owls, or I guess any sort of roosting bird. It can be very disorienting for them and prevent them from flying. If they're flying and they get flashed, you can really terrorize them. And a side note, wildlife on public lands is also hunted, so you kind of want to be careful with what you post and what you share, at least about the individual animals, because I've had a lot of interest in where I camera trap from hunters. Let's see if this will work. Okay, here's an example of a mountain lion having its pictures taken. So you can see she's actually pretty chill with it. She doesn't even look at it. She continues to, that was on a scrape site, so she smells the scrape and just moves on. So a lot of people ask me if it's really distracting or cruel to the animals, at least especially with the mountain lions and most of my subjects. Absolutely not. Safety. So you definitely want to lock up your camera, and locks and chains are good. I use bike locks for humans, and I've also used chains to keep bears from accessing my gear. I definitely try to avoid spots that get human activity. If I get pictures of humans on my camera, I will pull the camera. You want to put your camera in a solid case. You can buy prefabricated ones. I built mine personally. There's a picture here of mine on the ground after that three-legged bear found it. Yeah. And then carry bear spray, because while you're looking for spots that you might find the subject, you might end up actually running into them instead. Just happened a few times. As far as legality goes, camera trapping is not allowed in the national parks at all, no exceptions. It is allowed on private land and it is allowed on public land, although for commercial film, you need a film permit. But for just photography, you're good. Trail cams and cellular cams are kind of a gray area because in some places it's illegal to use them to aid hunting. Obviously, that's not what I'm doing, but I've heard of people having them confiscated anyways. And then winter closures are a huge thing here. You definitely want to pay attention to where you're hiking, what kind of closures are in place between the months of December and May. So just as a summary, more thoughts. Camera trapping involves a lot of working parts and it's a complex art form, but I think it's so worth it when you get your unique candid shots of wildlife. It's a great way to give new life to old camera gear that you wouldn't otherwise be using. Capturing wildlife that most people don't see or experience encourages people to protect them. And what I mean by that is that animals like cougars are mostly unseen by people. And being able to take images of them and show people that they are here, that they are complex sentient beings, it encourages people to be more mindful of them and inspire conservation of them. Where like the grizzlies and the wolves have people that view them, that are big fans of them, that want to protect them. Some other animals aren't so lucky. So it's a great way to create images for a conservation minded purpose too. And it's like Christmas morning whenever you check your camera. It's so exciting because you always think the best. You always want to know what's come by in the couple weeks that you've left it out. Sometimes when you see it knocked over, you know something good came by too. Okay, well, does anyone have any questions?
So earlier in the day, Savannah was telling me just a little bit about some of the things that's happened to her cameras. So maybe cover a couple of those things we had talked about earlier, besides the one bear, but you had mentioned some other things that really seem to that's happened to your gear.
Yeah, so I've had bears knock it over. That's pretty routine. I've had a mountain lion cub chew on the handle, which was cool because I was watching it from a blind at the time. So there's little bite marks on the handle. But more so, I've had people find it. I've had it flashed. I've had some guy unplug everything. I have had videos of people saying that they wanted to come back and steal it and they planned on stealing it. Because I usually have a trail cam recording video at the same time. But I've never actually had someone go to the lengths of going all the way home and getting bolt cutters and coming all the way back. So far I've been lucky on that front. But yeah, there's a lot of exciting things that go down in the deep woods when no one's around.
Savannah, you mentioned a couple of times being in a blind while a camera and a trap was shooting mountain lions. And I was just wondering about that. I mean, they have a very acute sense of smell. How close were you in a blind? Like, how does that work?
I think it was about 75 yards. They probably knew we were in there, but we were completely covered up. Everything was hidden. We were making very little noise and they didn't mind at all. Mm-hmm. They fed there the entire night until they took off, and then we left at the same time they did, probably in the middle of the night. It was a really once in a lifetime experience. It was so cool.
You weren't concerned that they might perceive you as somehow competition for their prey? And that's what would come to my mind.
Mountain lions are pretty chill in my experience. I've run into them very close on multiple occasions. They usually just hold tight. They don't really, they're not like a grizzly bear where it's going to come after you. The biggest threat would be bumping it off of the kill. This particular lion had been photographed for a long time. She's like 15 years old. She was part of the Teton Cougar Project, so she's kind of used to people in that way. So she was a pretty safe subject. a good candidate for being watched from a blind.
That makes sense. Thank you.
Of course.
For someone that's just starting, other than the camera, tripod, that sort of stuff, and just is curious about, well, would this be good for me? How much would it cost for all that material at a real basic level?
I think that when I've set up camera traps, it's been between like $800 and $1,000. That's just a guess, but the cam traptions gear can be pretty expensive. Obviously, that's not including whatever camera bodies and lenses you have,
Sure.
because but you're going to need to get motion detector, flashes, unless you already have a flash that'll work, but most won't. Receivers, transmitters, lots of batteries, a case, that sort of thing.
Because your pictures of the mountain lions were just amazing. I mean, even though I'm not gonna, if I were to get them, it's not for other people. It's just the beauty of them, and the pictures are just perfect. You're knowing how far they are away. How far typically are they away from the camera? I
Good
would guess
question.
10, 15, 20, 25 yards apart.
Closer than that usually. I'll usually have the camera fairly close to the trail, but the flashes will be back a bit. It really depends on the situation, but they're fairly close. I use a 24 millimeter lens. I have a 24 to 120, so it's usually within that range, if that kind of gives you an idea of the compositions.
Okay. So you're using, you would always consider including or using a wide angle lens, not super wide angle lens, but the animal's not going to be that far off the trail, essentially.
Yeah, they get very close, especially mountain lions. The mountain lions just, they're very relaxed with the camera gear. I've never had one. I've never had one just completely freak out or run off. Sometimes they'll stop and sniff it, and then just keep going. So yeah, they'll get pretty close, even if they see it at a distance. So you don't need to use anything with a telephoto lens, and you can use a very wide angle lens. I've seen people do that. The images are pretty interesting. There's a lot of creative freedom, I think, with what you want to achieve. And you can also experiment using long exposures as well. That can be really cool.
Diana, a series of questions. When you set up your motion sensor, does it have the ability to determine where it's going to sense up to a certain distance, and beyond that not sense it?
Yes, there are sensitivity options, but what I typically do is try to place the motion sensor very close to where I want the image. I should have brought one. It's out in the woods right now, but they're a little box and they've got little doors on the front, and you can use the doors to manipulate the field of view on the motion sensor. So I will, what was that?
So that would go along with your manually setting your focal length as well.
Yes. So wherever I envision the animal to be, that's where I'll place the motion sensor nearby, as long as it's out of the composition. Trying to make the windows small. You actually really want it to be fairly small, because you want to just take pictures when it's in focus and not when it's out of range.
Do you tend to need to crop frequently or infrequently, or do you tend to get an ear and only an ear?
Both. I try to crop. I try to pick a spot that I want the cat to be in, and then just go for that. I sometimes end up cropping an image if the cat maybe came far to the right or left of the composition and there's a lot of negative space. But for the most part, you really want to try to get your composition in mind before it happens.
Okay, Thank you.
Of course.
So I have a question. You mentioned trail cams. How are trail cams different than camera trapping?
A trail cam it's all in one unit. They're pretty small. They're designed primarily for hunters to just wrap around the tree. They come with a strap. They take very small images, using a lot of them use infrared, but they're not a high-end camera gear. You're not getting like a good quality image. It's kind of an all-in-one unit. They do the battery life does last forever. So it's a great scouting tool. I like to have a bunch of, when I find a game trail, maybe I'll put a trail camera on it for several weeks to months, just to see what comes by. And if there's anything interesting going on, like let's say a bear is using it frequently, then I will say, okay, time to set up the real camera trap on it. And I'll use the information that was on the trail cam. Like, let's say that he tends to come by in the afternoons, then I'll expect that to be what I want to set my exposure at.
So I'm just curious, have you come across any evidence of wolverines in any particular areas?
I've tracked one time, and it was pretty cool because it used a wildlife underpass that actually went under the highway up on Togety Pass. So I followed him a while. The tracks were probably, I don't know, 12 hours old or something along those lines. I never saw it, but it was really cool to see. I did send it to the Wyoming war biologist, so it was cool to be able to report an actual wolverine. But no, I've never gotten one on any trail cams or camera traps.
Wow, nice, thank you.
Of course.
By the way, I just love that photograph that you have up.
Oh, thanks. I love his smile. He's a very handsome bear.
Is that Bruno?
It is Bruno, yeah.
Yeah, I was fascinated. I know we talked about this earlier, but that the wolves and the coyotes are very leery of your gear. That surprised me a little, I guess, but I didn't know. Yeah. How much location related that was in areas that where they might be getting hunted versus, I guess, not in the park, since you're not allowed to do camera trapping in the park. So yeah.
Well, it's interesting because the park itself does camera trapping, and I think that they have a lot more success with their wolves that are already, like, I don't think they're inherently scared of man-made equipment, but the ones that are around here, at least on the public lands that I camera trap on, are typically very heavily hunted. They're super suspicious of anything man-made. Like I said, I don't really disguise my camera traps because, at least in my mind, I just don't want to like scare an animal. I kind of want them to be able to see it before they approach it. But they don't go anywhere near it. I mean, I've seen the tracks in the snow come up to it and then just take a wide berth around and run off. But I don't really intend to intentionally camera trap wolves just because I don't want to bother them. It could happen though, of course. There's no controlling what comes by.
Oh, I was also interested, since I think you said your triggers are infrared or heat related. Do they work better in the winter versus the summer, or do you have any issues with it? Background heat?
I only know what I've heard, which some people have theorized that animals with heavy winter coats don't show up as well. I don't really know, because I just know what I've seen, which is sometimes the camera trap goes off based off of motion. It definitely goes off based on motion too, because if it's really windy, the grass moving in front of it will trigger it like crazy. Yeah, so the camtraptions gear, that's definitely the downside, is that if it's really windy out, it's going to trigger constantly. and just put like thousands of images on your card that you don't want. But I think the Cognisys is kind of like a laser beam that has to be crossed by animals, and that cuts down on the wind triggering situation.
Anybody else? I guess for everybody out there, we had discussed earlier but yeah, mirrorless cameras, this is probably one of their places, not the best place to use a mirrorless camera because the sensor has to be on all the time. So yeah, Savannah, when we talked earlier today, she had kind of verified that, yeah, a regular DSLR is a better tool here than a mirrorless camera. So
Yeah, in my opinion and some other people's opinion, it's just simpler technology. It works very well with this gear. I've used mirrorless cameras for camera trapping before. I really just like DSLRs. There's just a lot less that can go wrong, I think. Plus, it's nice to be able to recycle your old gear.
Yeah, those cameras that are sitting in the closet now have a use.
Yeah. Well, that's what I use mostly is my D750, which used to be my main camera body, and I never use it now. But now it has this whole new life where it's taking great images for me while I'm asleep in bed.
Have you had anybody steal your camera?
I've had people tamper with it, and I've had people try, and I've had people discuss in front of the camera how they're going to steal it. Say they're going to come back and steal it, but nobody ever has. Knock on wood so far.
So you use a chain to lock it to a tree or something?
Yes, or I use a bike lock as well.
Oh, okay.
I'm pretty paranoid. The chain mostly is to keep things from getting scattered around by bears. So I'll use chains if there's a bear involved.
Well, Savannah, thank you very much for sharing that with me. I don't know how much longer this will be. This was very informative and motivational because
Well,
I've
thank
got
you.
cameras that I don't use anymore. And now, wow, this would be fun to kind of try it out and see how it works. Thank
Yeah,
you.
and living around here, the backyard wildlife's incredible. So it could just be as simple as walking out your back door and seeing what comes by at night.
Yeah, well, that was the first thing I was thinking of. Yeah, thanks.
Of
Arnold,
course.
Thank you so
Arnold,
much.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks for inviting me. This was really fun.
Thank you.
yeah. Anybody else?
Just that I thought that was a wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
Something really different. Well, thank you.
So Arnold, you found a new use for your Leica?
His voice.
No,
Glorious.
I'm not quite sold there. I might have a D100 I could use though.
Good D1.
Oh. Great presentation. Thanks.
Thank you.
Cool. Well, thanks everybody for attending, and thanks Savannah. Yeah, we'll look forward to the newsletter. We'll get some details out about July and August, but let's see. And then, yeah, got a couple of thank yous on the chat. So no other